There are periods in history when the world seems to wake up from a nightmare. Times when wars painted the sky red, plagues turned cities into ghost towns, and even the most educated minds were held captive by superstition and fear of witchcraft. It was in just such an age, in the dark and misty lands of 16th century Hungary, that a woman was born whose name would be whispered for centuries. A noble woman whose beauty was legendary, whose wealth rivaled that of kings, and whose intelligence enchanted everyone. Yet behind that radiant face, it would be claimed that she harbored one of the darkest souls in human history. Today, you will not merely hear the story of a serial killer. Today, we will wander through the labyrinth of horrific rituals said to have been committed in pursuit of eternal youth. The screams embedded in the walls of a castle, political conspiracies, and one of history's greatest slanders. Presenting the woman whose name is tied to the blood of hundreds of innocents, history's most infamous woman, the Blood Countess, Elizabeth Báthory. And I will ask you this question: was she a monster, or was a monster made? Everything begins in the family, doesn't it? To understand Elizabeth's story, we must understand the blood that ran through her veins. The Báthorys were one of Hungary's oldest, wealthiest, and most powerful families. They had ruled Transylvania, provided kings to Poland, and, in short, had always had a say in the fate of the kingdom. But the price of this power was a dark legacy that had haunted the family for generations. Rumors of devil worship, incestuous relationships, epileptic seizures, and uncontrollable cruelty were considered part of Báthory blood. One of her uncles was known as the friend of the devil, while another was infamous for his extreme brutality. Elizabeth was born into the midst of such a genetic legacy. From her childhood, she was said to experience violent fits of rage, punishing even the smallest mistakes with disproportionate severity. Yet at the same time, she possessed a mind far ahead of her era. She spoke 4 languages, understood politics, and consistently demonstrated that she had the capacity to manage vast estates. This dangerous combination of intelligence and unchecked anger would make her both a very powerful and a very feared woman in the future. The family's best solution was to control this troublesome girl by marrying her at the age of 15 to the son of another family that was at least as powerful as their own. But this marriage would prove to be no less than adding fuel to the fire. It is often said that such great and systematic evil cannot be carried out alone. Elizabeth, too, had loyal accomplices who walked with her on this dark path. They were the main actors in this theater of horror. At the forefront was Ilona Jo, Elizabeth's nurse and confidant. Having known her since infancy, this elderly woman understood the darkness within her better than anyone else and nurtured it. She was the chief organizer of the tortures within the castle. The second figure was a woman named Dorothea Sentes. Known by the locals as a witch, she was skilled in herbs and potions, and she was the one who fueled Elizabeth's obsession with beauty. It is said that she was the person who convinced Elizabeth of the magical power of young girls' blood. And finally, there was János Újvári, known as Fico, who was said to be a dwarf. He was the brute force of this theater, capturing the victims, assisting in punishments, and most importantly, disposing of the evidence that needed to be erased. This demonic crew turned Čachtice Castle into a place that appeared, from the outside, to be a noble residence, but once the doors closed, became a rehearsal for hell itself. And as always, the first victims of this hell were those whose voices would never be heard. So, for whom were the gates of hell first opened? Who were those nameless, faceless victims? The first witnesses of Elizabeth's reign of terror were the young peasant girls living in the villages around her castle. burning with hope for a better life. They were the children of poor families, ready to do anything for a bowl of soup and a roof over their heads. For Elizabeth's sinister entourage, they were the perfect prey. Enticed by promises of servitude, dreams of fine dresses, and a comfortable life, they were brought to the castle. Yet the moment they stepped through those grand gates, they had unknowingly walked into a trap from which they would never again see the light of day. At first, everything seemed ordinary. Small household chores, endless cleaning. But soon, even the slightest mistakes turned into unimaginable punishments. A broken plate meant days of starvation. A task left unfinished could result in cigarettes being extinguished on their skin. Elizabeth seemed to take a strange pleasure in their screams of pain. For her, it was a display of power. The torment her husband inflicted on his enemies on the battlefield, she imposed upon the weakest of her own dominion. Yet sadism, once tasted, is like an insatiable hunger. And Elizabeth's hunger grew stronger with every passing day. It all began with a single slap. According to legend, one day, as a young maid was combing Elizabeth's hair, she accidentally hurt her. The Countess, enraged, struck the girl so hard that blood poured from her nose. A few drops splattered onto Elizabeth's hand. When she wiped it away, she thought the skin beneath looked smoother, younger, and fairer. It is said that in that moment, the dark whisper in Elizabeth's mind turned into a deafening scream. Her fear of aging, her panic over losing her beauty, merged with the cruelty she had kept restrained until then. If a single drop of blood could do this, what might a whole body's worth achieve? That simple yet horrifying thought became the first step toward the obsession that would turn her into one of history's most brutal serial killers. From then on, the tortures were no longer just punishments, but parts of a dreadful ritual with a terrifying purpose: beauty. That immortal desire which, throughout history, has toppled empires and ignited wars. For Elizabeth, this desire was becoming an obsession, and the obsession, a bloodthirsty ritual. With the help of her nurse, Ilona, and the so-called witch, Dorothea, the castle's basement was transformed into a beauty laboratory, or rather, a slaughterhouse. The girls were no longer merely beaten. Their blood was now systematically drained. Specially crafted needles, scissors, knives. These instruments were used to bleed the victims dry, down to the very last drop. The allegations were so horrifying that some spoke of a room in the castle where an iron cage hung from the ceiling. The victim would be placed inside, the cage hoisted upward, and the spikes beneath would pierce her body, while Elizabeth stood directly below, bathing in a fresh rain of blood. These rituals soon became the Countess's daily routine. In the mornings, she was said to bathe in tubs filled with the blood of young girls, and at night, she smeared it across her face as a mask before sleeping. She believed it stopped time, that it rejuvenated her skin. By then, the castle walls were steeped in screams and the stench of blood. Yet outwardly, everything appeared normal. Elizabeth Báthory was still regarded as the intelligent, powerful, and respectable noblewoman, until her insatiable vanity drove her to her greatest mistake. For years, the walls of Čachtice Castle swallowed hundreds of screams. But there is a rule: power always demands more. And Elizabeth was about to make her gravest error. The number of peasant girls was dwindling, and their disappearances had become noticeable. Yet her obsession with beauty did not relent. She decided she needed better, more pure blood. And that blood had to be noble blood. Relying on her family's power, She began inviting the daughters of lower-ranking noble families to her castle under the pretense of giving them courtly etiquette training. This was the beginning of the end, for while no one asked questions about missing peasant girls, a noblewoman's disappearance would always summon her family's wrath. Whispers had grown into a deafening cry, and that cry finally reached the king's court. The complaints of noble families, combined with the horrifying testimony of a girl who had managed to escape the castle, became impossible for King Matthias II to ignore. He entrusted the matter to Hungary's Palatine, the highest-ranking official, György Thurzó. Thurzó heard the testimony of hundreds of witnesses, former castle staff, families of the victims, each recounting the same horrors. On the night of December 30th, 1610, Thurzó and his soldiers launched a sudden raid on Čachtice Castle. What they claimed to have found was worse than the darkest nightmare. In the main hall, a girl writhing in agony, drenched in blood. In the dungeon, others chained up. And in the gardens, dozens of hastily buried corpses. The Blood Countess had been caught red-handed. But what became of the Blood Countess herself? This noblewoman, accused of hundreds of murders? History sometimes writes the strangest endings for its greatest monsters. Her accomplices, her nurse, the witch, and the dwarf Fico, were immediately arrested. At trial, they confessed everything. Their punishment was gruesome. Their fingers were torn off, and they were burned alive. But Elizabeth Báthory came from such a powerful family that putting her on public trial and executing her would have caused a scandal across the kingdom. So no trial was ever held. The king and Thurzó decided her fate themselves. Her sentence, life imprisonment. But not in an ordinary prison. She was sealed inside her own bedchamber at Čachtice Castle. Its doors and windows were bricked up, leaving only a small opening through which food could be passed. The woman who once prided herself on her beauty, who made all tremble with her power, was now entombed in her own private grave, alone, condemned to darkness. She lived in that sealed room for 4 years, until on August 21st, 1614, the guards found her dead when they delivered her meal, and thus the story of the Blood Countess came to an end. Or did it, truly? Here, we return to the question we asked at the very beginning. Was she a monster, or was a monster created? Today, many historians argue that Elizabeth's story might in fact have been nothing more than a political conspiracy. Báthory was a Protestant woman. She possessed enormous wealth and estates inherited from her late husband, and she had lent vast sums of money to the Catholic king. Eliminating her might have been the perfect way to destroy a Protestant power while erasing a massive debt and seizing her fortune. It is also true that many testimonies were taken under torture, and the most sensational claims, like the infamous blood baths, were only recorded years after her death. Perhaps Elizabeth was merely a cruel feudal lady, judged harsh even by the standards of her own era, and her enemies twisted that cruelty into the legend of a monster. Or perhaps every word is true, and she was indeed one of the darkest souls in human history. Whatever the truth may be, the story of Elizabeth Báthory reminds us of just how corrupting power can be, how often truth is lost behind the misty veil of rumor, and how even the most terrifying monsters sometimes begin as human. The choice is yours. Do you believe the Blood Countess was a murderer, or the victim of one of history's greatest conspiracies? Share your thoughts in the comments.